You're listening to the Alchemical Tech Revolution, and I am your host, Wayne McCroy. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are around the world. Tonight, we're going to explore the 7 rays of the QBL. We're going to be reading tonight from a book of the same name by the late, great Frater Albertus. And before we actually get into the meat of the matter here tonight, we'll give you a little bit of a background about Frater Albertus, and we'll get into some details about some of the things we've spoken of here in the past, how we talked about how different forces and or energies inherent in the sky clock above us have an effect here in the physical world. This is something that is explored in great detail in this work from Frater Albertus and is explored in some of the other occult literature of the past out there. And of course, we're talking about this idea of rays. And of course, they always use the number 7, and that does correspond with the number of colors in the traditional rainbow. And there's a reason for that, as we will see here tonight. This has everything to do with frequency, vibration, and all of those different things associated with the electromagnetic spectrum, and how it crosses the bounds of the physical into the hyperphysical and into the metaphysical. So all of these things are very important. So without further ado, we're going to look first in this originally published book, and this is a reprint from 1985, put into publication by Samuel Weiser Incorporated, who had access to the estate of Frater Albertus. And we have a little bit of an introduction here to give a little context to who Frater Albertus was and why this is very much an important document for exploring these different avenues of thought. Frater Albertus, otherwise known as Dr. Albert Richard Rydell, was published under the name of Albertus Spagyricus in his earliest writings, all of which are important to the serious student. Born on May 5th, 1911 in Dresden, Germany, Frater Albertus passed away on July 14th, 1984 in Salt Lake City, Utah. History will undoubtedly record Frater Albertus as one of the truly great alchemical teachers of modern time. He was a spiritual alchemist whose traditional oral teachings entwined alchemical laboratory procedures with the mystical Kabbalah. I'm going to pause for a second to note that Kabbalah, spelled with a Q, is the one inherent here. And as we see in the title of the book and the episode title here, the 7 rays of the QBL is another term that some of these alchemists have used to refer to the Kabbalah, the real Kabbalah, and that is the one that starts with the letter Q. Now, there are several iterations of Kabbalah, and we've covered these ideas here in the past. If you want to go back and listen to some past episodes where we spoke about that, that is another interesting topic altogether. But QBL, the Kabbalah, spelled with a Q, that's what's being referred to here. So Frater Albertus entwined the alchemical laboratory procedures with these notions of the mystical Kabbalah, astrology, universal law, and the disciplines of higher thought. In 1960, he founded the Paracelsus Research Society in Salt Lake City, Utah, with the goal of improving the knowledge and lives of mankind, making openly available heretofore the hidden teachings which in centuries past had been dispensed from master to student or from master to apprentice in a closed-door situation. To this end, he worked unceasingly, teaching throughout the world and establishing additional schools in Australia and Europe. Gonna pause before we continue. So Frater Albertus set up the Paracelsus Research Society, and this is one of Frater Albertus's most notable contributions, is he made this stuff available in the modern era to people who normally would have no access. You see, all of this stuff was always taught behind closed doors, in secret from master to apprentice or master to student, in an unbroken succession down the line. But something different happened in the modern era, wherein much of this information has now been made available to the public, and of course you could talk to different people as to the reasons why that is. But certainly I think it's important that we have this information readily available to us, and we can thank Frater Albertus for putting some of his thoughts on paper for us to be able to go back and look at this so that we can know some things that had been long hidden from mankind for many, many generations, for millennia, in fact. So this continues here, and it says, this revised and expanded edition of the Seven Rays of the QBL is the culmination of his remarkable study of the Kabbalah and the natural cycles of mankind. Unfortunately, Frater Albertus passed away before the publication of this work was complete. So I'm going to pause there. So he originally wrote this in 1967 and 1968, and it never got published until after his death. He died in 1984. This came out in 1985. This is a 1985 edition that we are reading from. We're going to skip over some sections, and I want to get right to some of the heart of the matter, because we have covered some of the very same things in the introductory part here in the past. So I wanted to get to some of the bits that pertain to this notion of the seven rays themselves, and to the importance of the color spectrum, and of these different energies that are present in our sky that affect life here on Earth. So without further ado, let's get into it. We're going to read a section here titled Cosmic Rays. Gamma rays and X-rays are only two examples of the various cosmic rays referred to when planetary rays are considered. Variations in mass, polarity charge, their speed of travel, and their frequencies provide us with a key for the origin and the specific functions of such rays. Science deals with manifold manifestations of rays and catalogs their characteristics. The nearest description of cosmic rays is that they behave like photons of electromagnetic energy, perhaps many octaves above presently measurable frequencies. Going to pause for a moment. So now Frater Albertus makes mention of photons, and we'll see as we continue here, and it is of my opinion and of my experience in exploring these avenues of thought, I think the notion of photons is a misconception, but it is a man-made reification to try to quantify these very energies that we're speaking of. Now, is that a bad thing? No, not necessarily. If you've listened to the broadcast for any length of time, you know that the quantification of everything is one of the main purposes of many of those controllers of this world. They want to be able to quantify everything. They want to be able to weigh and measure everything, even if it is an imprecise measurement, because that gives them some means or modality of control over those things. So it's an important concept to quantify things. Thus, we have reifications like the electron and the photon in our modern science. In my view, these are misunderstandings of how these things truly work, but they do have a useful purpose for those who are seeking to try to find a mathematical reification for all of this, a formula that they could use to steer things in certain directions. Even if it is an imprecise amount of control, it does offer a means of control over these things. So photons are one of those reifications that are made here. So we see photons of electromagnetic energy are a portion of what's being explored here. It is given as a description of how these cosmic rays work. The similarity of planetary rays to these rays is quite marked. Number one, both display chromatic characteristics of their source. Number two, both can be focused upon a point and reflected from it. Number three, both represent phenomena of interference. And number four, variations in the combinations of colors produce secondary, tertiary, and other colors. So I'm going to pause for a moment. So now it's making a distinguishing characteristic between what we are calling planetary rays here and cosmic rays, although there are commonalities between them. Now, planetary rays, these would be those rays, those sources of light which are within our solar system in the grand cosmology of things. And of course, the cosmic rays term, these come from outside this solar system. Now, all of this has very different meanings within the realms of the occult teachings than what you would expect on the modern scientific paradigm level. But certainly, we can take some of these ideas and look at them from the philosophical perspective and understand that we do have these energetic influences that come from outside of the Earth, and they do have a very real effect here on Earth. That's the important notion behind all of this. The origin of these planetary rays is of a similar nature as that of the light rays of the sun. All of them are highly penetrative photon quantas of energy which travel with immense speed in straight lines until they strike our Earth or other celestial bodies. They are scientifically classified into two groups. The first contains all those rays which emanate from an assumed source or point of origin. The second group consists of rays which were focused upon a specific point or heavenly object and which were then reflected from it. It is known that all material objects are surrounded by auras. The rays or waves with which we are concerned in this treatise radiate from the auras of the planets. Gonna pause for a moment here now. This is where an important distinction is being made here by Frater Albertus, and this crosses the bounds into the metaphysical. The aura of these various planetary bodies, or these objects in the sky, are what are producing these rays that penetrate the Earth. Now, are these visible light spectrum rays? Maybe they are, and maybe they aren't, and we'll see how they do have color associated with them. These are properties of the light that aren't readily accepted by science. They do have a specific metaphysical energetic principle or footprint behind them, and this is known to many of those high echelon occultists in this world, and those within the auspices of the power structure of this world, that they manipulate and leverage for their own beneficial purposes against the rest of humanity. Now keep that in mind as we progress here through the reading. So the importance here is these planetary bodies, or these objects in the sky, they have an aura about them, and it is from this aura that we get these principles of these rays that penetrate the Earth. So Frater Albertus continues here, and he says, for example, if a rod is doused with water, it will be strongly influenced by the aura of the water. The proportionately larger masses of the planets exert correspondingly more powerful and also more easily recognizable auric influences. Scientific laboratories will someday contain apparatus which will measure these types of planetary emanations based on the law of polarity, as above, so below, as below, so above. We postulate that auric rays are of a similar nature to those already researched and analyzed by science. They are only of a finer texture, clearer color, and of a higher energy. The transmission of light energy by colors is of profound importance in this treatise. It gives the Qabalistic theory of colors a credible basis, which in turn is fundamental for the correlation of subsequent results. The various combinations of primary colors and the colors that result from these combinations influence all matter and its evolution. Going to pause for a moment here. So now we're speaking of color. And we're speaking of a finer grade of color, a higher energy of this color. So he's speaking about a metaphysical influence within the color spectrum. This is something that cannot necessarily currently be scientifically measured or validated, but there is a footprint or an energy signature behind these colors, the higher frequencies, the higher vibratory rate of these colors. Now, this is referred to across the board by many occultists as the concept of the octave. And it's the raising of the octave, the next level up, in the color spectra. So it's not something that's necessarily visible in the visible light spectrum, but it does have a very real influence here. Now, this is a different way of thinking. So for anybody who's new to all of these ways of thinking, I would recommend picking up some of Walter Russell's work and looking at what he says about octaves. This is a different way of thinking about things. It's a step up, the next grade up, and when you think about the visible light color spectrum, we have the 7 colors of the rainbow. Well, if you repeat the next octave higher, the 8th color would be the first color in the next rainbow octave. So it would be a different level above or higher than the color spectrum we have now. It's a different way of viewing things. It's a philosophical way of viewing things. And of course, all of those who are firmly entrenched in our modern scientism would reject the notion outright. But it seems that there's something real to this idea. It's a different resonating frequency, a different resonant frequency, a level higher. Now you could correspond this to sound, because did not Nikola Tesla inform us that light is nothing more than a sound wave in the ether? They're very much related. It's all the same type of thing. Electromagnetic frequency and sound have a lot of correlating and corresponding attributes, one to another. So we can make analogies based upon this, the things we know about sound and how it works. You could actually make the same kinds of connections to light. So in sound, we accept that there are octaves. Well, in light, it would appear there also are octaves. Continuing on, Frater Albertus informs us the various combinations of primary colors, or the colors that result from these combinations, influence all matter and its evolution. The attempt is made in this analysis to correlate cosmic rays with astrocyclic pulsations, which will be dealt with in the next chapter of this reading, and I don't know how far we'll get here tonight. This will likely continue in a part 2, and maybe even beyond that. It may become apparent, even to the casual reader, that a close resemblance exists between scientific terminology and observed phenomena. Employing the Qabalistic approach to identify various color combinations, we derive primary, secondary, tertiary, and other colors. Such a differentiation is based on the change of frequencies or vibrations. Each consonant particle of matter is related to a specific color and responds accordingly. A multitude of manifestations is due to the almost infinite possible variations to be found in the receptors indicated by their diversity of mass and density. It would require an acute observer to recognize and to differentiate the influences of these subtle rays. Discernment of fine color nuances is facilitated by the use of periodic astrocyclic manifestations. Since astrocyclic pulsations are applicable to the most minute organisms, we are in a position to set forth relationships which would otherwise be extremely difficult to fathom. Relatively decreasing vibratory rates expose phenomena and reactions from which computations of relative frequencies become possible. When the ancients claimed that everything vibrates, that nothing rests, that everything is in a perpetual state of flux, manifesting itself through vibrations, they acknowledged an ever-present energy that produces motion out of itself, that is, a perpetuum mobile. The ever-present state of becoming to which everything is subjected, due to the perpetual motion which is found in the universe, has its origin in cosmic order and lawfulness. Motion may appear limited within particles, but this is only an appearance. In reality, it never ceases. Gonna pause for a moment. So now we have some important ideas. Everything is always in a constant state of flux. This is something that the Hermeticists have always acknowledged. And it's something that's observable and has stood the test of time. You can acknowledge that throughout the course of life. Everything changes. Change is inevitable. And we all go through minute changes day in and day out. This is the only constant that we truly have in this reality. Everything's in this state of flux all the time. It is what he calls the state of becoming. We are becoming something more. We are constantly living through this cyclical process where we are becoming something more. So let's continue. It says, vibrations, which are to be found in all manifestations, never cease and are, as perpetuating energy, the transmitters of consciousness found by degrees in all organisms. Going to pause for a moment here again. Now this is at the heart and soul of everything. It's about the nature of consciousness itself. Do you understand? All of creation is a type of conscious being of sorts, and we have all of this permeation of these life energies throughout, which have a type of consciousness. Now, it may not be the same as human consciousness or awareness as we would like to acknowledge it, but it is a type of consciousness. It's a type of this vibratory state, this constant change, this constant motion, this perpetuum mobile, as it's called here by Frater Albertus. It's all about these life energies, and some have referred to this life energy as prana in some of the other occult systems. And it permeates everything, even the minerals and non-living objects as we acknowledge them. Vibrations can be determined with the help of colors. In essence, all organisms can be viewed as the sum total of the influences of planetary rays. In this manner, all planetary influences upon terrestrial matter can be registered. Thus, rays are carriers of energy and are differentiated into many frequencies. These rays, through the exhibition of their characteristics, provide the investigator with certain norms. Even though we are presently in no position to fully comprehend the significance and importance of planetary emanations, we are able to distinguish their functions, provided we recognize and utilize them in an intelligent manner. Without a mastery of consciousness over mind and matter, as this treatise tries to make clear, a profound understanding of cosmic influences is inconceivable. When, in addition to considering the energies and rays of the celestial bodies of our immediate solar system, the impulses of the farthest depths of space are also considered, we practically find ourselves inundated in a sea of cosmic energy. It is truly amazing that the human brain is capable of absorbing so much and is able to differentiate between the various influences of cosmic rays and their potentials. Gonna pause for a moment here. So we are, in fact, even according to the scientific mainstream, inundated with various cosmic rays from all over the place that they scarcely understand. They can measure some of these commodities, others they really don't understand and don't have proper equipment to measure, and they do have a type of hyperphysical and metaphysical type of propagation behind them as well. And these energies affect life on Earth, and that is the important thing to keep in mind. So for generations now, we've been taught that things like astrology are silly and nonsensical. There's nothing to them. But there is something to them. It is acknowledged by the scientific mainstream that things like gamma rays coming from space, or cosmic rays of all sorts, neutrinos, all kinds of different energy signatures they can measure, can affect things on Earth. And even the presence of sunlight affects everything here on Earth. So does it really sound so nonsensical to think that emanations from other sources in space that affect us on Earth in certain ways is silly to think about? I think it stands to reason to say there is something there. There's a there. Shall we put it that way? Let's go ahead and continue. So Frater Albertus next says that science now begins to substantiate some of the axioms which the Paracelsus College is teaching. Dr. Irving S. Bengelsdorf, science editor of the Los Angeles Times, discussed the following in an article titled Of Atoms and Men, and he says, quote, "In the pineal gland, there is a protein known as an enzyme that has the ability to produce melatonin from a chemically related material called serotonin, and rat pineal gland is chock full of serotonin. The amounts of both serotonin and the enzyme that makes melatonin that are present in the pineal gland depend upon the time of day. Serotonin content is highest at noon, when enzyme content is lowest, and enzyme content is highest at midnight when serotonin content is lowest. In other words, the pineal gland is a biological clock. This has led doctors Wertman and Axelrod to examine other organs. They now find that the amount of tyrosine transaminase, an important enzyme in the liver, also depends upon the time of day. Every afternoon, the amount of this liver enzyme begins to increase at 4 p.m. and quadruples in amount by 8 p.m. that evening, returning back to its original level by 8 a.m. the next morning. The cyclic rise and fall of this enzyme is precise like clockwork. It may turn out that the amounts of other important chemicals in the body change in rhythmic cyclic fashion each day. This research suggests that a person's behavior to a drug may depend not only upon the nature of the drug, but also upon the time of the day that it is taken. And that is the end of the quote from this article. And I'm going to go ahead and give some more context to this. Many of the things that this gentleman talked about in this article have now been validated scientifically in the scientific mainstream. Your body does have different processes that occur at different times of the day based upon the presence or absence of sunlight. And these various enzymes and chemicals in the body work in the fashion as described here. This is a known scientific commodity at this point. It's also important to acknowledge what this last sentence revealed to us here. It says that a person's behavior to a drug may not depend only on the nature of the drug, but on the time of day that it's taken. This is also an important concept, and this is something that the alchemists always understood and knew. And even when they were making any type of a healing product of sorts, any type of a tincture or a spagyric or any type of a medicinal herb or medicinal substance of any sort, it's about the time when they produce it as well. The time of the harvest of the herbs. All of these things have a critical role, and a lot of this has been lost to modern science. And it's also important what time of day you take this. And of course, this is cyclical with the seasons as well. You could put the correspondence there across the board. So this is an important concept, and this is something that has never been lost on the alchemists. But our modern day chemistry loses sight of all of this, and thus there's something missing in modern medicine because of the absence of timing in a lot of it. And this has to do with the cyclical nature of our reality and of these cosmic rays and these planetary rays that are being discussed here by Frater Albertus. Keep this stuff in mind. Now, I know this sounds like a lot of nonsense and hokum to people who aren't familiar with many of the precepts of alchemy, but all of these things have subtle influences in our physical world that most people overlook or don't even know about. And that is something the alchemists always focused on. You see, intention is one of the key precepts to any of this stuff. Intention and utilizing the right cycles of nature and the right timing of the cycles of nature to produce any given thing, any given change in the nature of things. So with that being said, let's go ahead and we will continue reading here. So Frater Albertus continues, and he says, "That man appeared as man upon earth, and not as a mouse, or a worm, or a plant, or a rock, cannot be considered as a coincidence. One cannot ignore the fact that the world we live in is an exquisitely organized system. It is gratifying to know that scientists are now approaching cyclic time functions and their rhythmic effects in a more profound manner than was previously the case. What a short time ago was not even found to be worthy of any consideration is now becoming accepted fact. In reality, the orderliness and lawfulness of the universe are the foundation of our ability to reason. We have learned to differentiate and to utilize for our well-being the shifting positions of the planetary bodies and the different arcs and aspects of the planets to Earth that result from this shifting. Our use of time and tide arose out of the necessity to utilize environmental circumstances and even to improve upon them. Adjustments for undesirable conditions were often made when the appropriate influences of planetary rays were favorable for the intended purposes. Thus, the cyclic norms of this treatise are beginning to get close attention by the world of science. Eventually, entirely new concepts with regard to cyclic influences upon all organisms will emerge." I'm going to pause for a moment here. Here is where I think Frater Albertus was extremely hopeful. It seems to me that since this time, when many of these ideas were coming around into the scientific mainstream, a lot of them got tamped down. They tried to make it sound silly and nonsensical. They tried to quench this acceptance of these natural energies being inherent. Now, in some of the sciences, they have explored them in greater depths, and in many of the other material sciences which we have today, they've tried their very best to not even consider the metaphysical concepts associated with these things. But perhaps we will see a change in upcoming years here. Maybe man will begin to acknowledge the spiritual side of things and realize that there is an inherent intelligence in the design of this reality. Now, many within the highest, most echelons of our modern scientific community espouse this notion of atheism, that there does not need to be a God in order for these things to exist, and that everything happened by random chance. And here we are, the result of that. I do not accept that paradigm, and any honest assessment of the universe around us will tell you that there is intelligence inherent in its design and its function. Otherwise, it would not be here. I don't know how people could skirt around that idea, but they do time and time again. And of course, this leads to philosophies like secular humanism and all of the things that go with it, which invariably lead to the notion of transhumanism. But that's a subject for another day. Let's get back on topic here. Rays, as such, should not be confused with what are known as sunbeams, which are produced by atmospheric pressure or by cloud dispersion of the sunlight. The invisible energy of the sun becomes visible and manifests as force only when it encounters a corresponding resistor. An example may be appropriate here. The palm of the hand, when extended toward the sun, will absorb as much of the sun's rays as it is able to assimilate or to resist. This is felt as the measurable force of these rays, or as heat. A change in the density of an object will cause a greater or lesser degree of resistance and result in correspondingly higher or smaller degrees of heat. When these rays are concentrated upon a point with the help of a glass lens or a prism, the concentrated force meeting such resistance will release its energy as fire. Almost everyone has at some time held a magnifying glass toward the sun in order to concentrate the sun's rays upon a piece of white paper. At first, the rays cause a dark pinhead-sized spot on the paper, which suddenly grows to a hole and finally ignites the paper. The resulting flame is the visible reaction brought about by the concentrated invisible energy which is carried by the sun's rays. Thus, we establish the fact that rays are carriers of energy, whereby invisible force becomes visible when it meets a resistor. Going to pause for a moment. Now, this is the crux of the matter. These invisible forces become visible when they meet a resistor, and these rays are the transmitters of these invisible forces. Now, some of these rays may be visible, and some of them may be invisible. We're seeing here through the law of analogy what Frater Albertus is telling us. It does not mean that there's nothing to this idea that there are energies inherent. It's just these invisible rays may not be perceivable until such time as they are pinpointed in a specific fashion. The sun, the source of energy, is the only immediately observable producer of these forces which make all life possible on Earth when it meets the resistance of this planet. In absence of such forces, that is, the sun's failure to produce the essential heat, would leave this planetary body dead and extinct of all forms of life. Considerable contention arises with regard to the astrocyclic influences upon individuals and living organisms. Gravitation is the only scientifically recognized interacting force in celestial mechanics. Since no relationships per se are readily observable between the force of gravity and the mental impulses of the planets, their interaction is given little credence. Nevertheless, gravitational pull is based on the immaterial essence of the celestial bodies. The resulting energy exerts an enormous force upon a given planetary mass and therefore necessarily affects all matter and living organisms associated with it. Now I'm going to pause for a moment here. So Frater Albertus draws the distinction here between the analogy of gravity and these other forces. Now, science readily accepts gravity, even though it scarcely understands it, doesn't really understand it, but it accepts the reality of it, but yet it questions the reality of these other types of resulting energies. They may not acknowledge it in the scientific mainstream because they have no way to really measure it, doesn't mean that it doesn't have an effect. And this is something that's been known to the old occult sciences for the longest time. And this is something that's known to those in the highest, most echelons of power in this world. And this is one of the primary things that they leverage against the masses. The influence of these rays. They know how to leverage them. They understand certain properties associated with them. When they understand what is the source in the sky of this energetic presence. That's why things like planetary alignments crop up so much in the timing of things, dates, times, all of these various things have a real influence. This is why world leaders have always conscripted astrologers to help them in decision-making processes. Even in the modern era, you could go back and look at Ronald Reagan, for example. He openly and knowingly had advisors who utilized astrological notions to help guide him in policy making. This is an accepted and known thing in the modern era. So certainly they've always had these advisors. And there's a reason for that, because this stuff works. It works. That's the bottom line. That's why it's all been with us, even right up into modern times. If there was nothing to it, this information would have largely disappeared by now. But instead, you have people trying to make it sound silly and nonsensical, but at the same time, those in the highest levels of power in this world utilize these principles all the time to benefit their agendas. That's enough of an aside on that. Let's get back to the reading. Actually, the whole matter of interacting planetary and other forces is not as simple as may be imagined. For example, the sunspots, which regularly manifest themselves in a rhythmic fashion approximately every 11th year, cause atmospheric disturbances on Earth that interfere with electromagnetic conditions. This definitely points to a distinct correlation between the sun's radiation and electromagnetic rays. Gravity is decidedly long-ranging force acting in space, but with correspondingly weaker strength in the subatomic world. This interesting fact was brought to light by Dr. Murray Gell-Mann, professor of theoretical physics at the California Institute of Technology, in a lecture delivered at the Institute's 75th anniversary on October 25, 1966, entitled The Elementary Particles of Nature. Professor Gell-Mann stated that in addition to the forces of gravity and electromagnetism, two other forces discovered during the 20th century are also responsible for subnuclear processes. These weaker interactions cause a particular radioactive decomposition and strong interactions which are considered responsible for connecting atomic nuclei. Further, Gell-Mann pointed out that if Planck's quantum theory is applied to microscopic physics, an analogy between the macro and micro worlds as a magnificent but confusing discipline results. Going to pause for a moment here. So now we see why it is that they keep exploring this prospect of quantum physics, because if you can apply an analogy between the macro scale and the micro scale with Planck's quantum theory, you can reify certain prospects in a measurable way. This is why they are so obsessed with the world of quantum, even though, in my view, the descriptions they give us of quantum theory are not how it really works, are not accurate in how it works. It does give them a type of quantification, thus the name quantum. Therefore, they are able to measure something, apply a mathematical formula to it to steer it in a generalized direction, thus giving them some control over the thing. So they've applied this on the micro scale, and they intend to apply it on the macro scale. As above, so below, as within, so without. Do you understand? So this is what it's about. It's about establishing a way to control things on both levels, on a micro level and a macro level, and applying a formula in a scientific way to do so. That's what quantum theory is all about. So even if it is an imprecise way of measuring a thing, it does give them a type of control over it when they could apply a mathematical formula or process to it to achieve a desired result. So they've utilized material science in trying to quantify these very metaphysical type concepts. And that's what we're observing in the world around us, and that is why they still go down this trail of quantum physics, even though they can't seem to make it jive with the macro scale physics that we have. They are still trying to make the connection there and come up with a grand unifying theory. Sufficient acknowledgement of the interrelationships of such forces is to be found in these deliberations of an eminent scientist. In general, it is assumed that forces are transmitted by means of quantum particles. For example, the photon quantum of energy acts as a carrier of electromagnetic forces. There would have to be another carrier for the force of gravity, yet to be discovered and to be named as another scientific exposition of the fact that rays are carriers of forces. All of this implies a definite correlation between the world of the astronomers and that of the microphysicists and biologists. These manifesting forces, irrespective of their names, have to be reckoned with in scientific analyses. Going to pause for a moment here. So essentially, to translate that for you, what Frater Albertus is saying is the very same thing I was espousing, that they come up with these quantification systems for these various things that they don't quite necessarily understand the operational principles thereof, but they come up with these man-made reifications so that they can apply a mathematical formula to it and give them some type of generalized control of the thing. Thus, things like the photon quantum of energy as a carrier of electromagnetic forces comes up, and I think they're trying to develop a notion of gravity that's somewhat similar, speculating on gravitons and things like that. A particle. You see, everything's about fundamental particles to these people, the particle zoo, all of this. That all applies in this quantum scale of things. They need it to be a fundamental particle in order for them to come up with a quantification system for it. Because something as generalized as a wave or a ray is too hard to measure without having a precise, pinpoint, accurate reading thereof. Thus, even if it is an imprecise measurement, they come up with a particle to describe such a thing. I hope this makes sense to you. This is about changing from broad spectrum view to point source. You see, if they could apply point source to all of these various forces, they can magnify these forces in many different ways and utilize them and wield them in ways that can bring about fundamental, huge changes in the world around them. And that is what they seek to do through the use of this quantification system that they call quantum science. So even, as I said, if it's not an accurate descriptor of how things really work on a fundamental level, it does give them a type of mathematical precision for steering and guiding things. Thus, they do so. But let's continue. Scientifically established transmutations of substances such as uranium into plutonium and neptunium imply an intelligent application of the observed behavior of substances. In scientific transmutations, electrons and other charged particles must pass through an electric field of force in order to come into contact with the nucleus. When such forces exert influences which can modify the formation of matter, then, by inference, the law of polarity must also have a similar impact on the immaterial or the conscious mental plane. Gonna pause for a moment here. So now this is where the rubber meets the road. If you can affect the physical, you can affect the metaphysical. It's two sides of the same coin. It's about the reverse order of manifestation. It's about manifesting something in the physical that they intend to have manifest in the mental plane. And I hope this makes sense to you. It's the reverse causative force. Causation occurs first in the mental plane and then steps down through steps into the physical plane via the astral and then the etheric and then the dense physical plane on which we exist. This is the normal, natural means of manifestation. But if they can institute a change on a fundamental level here on the physical plane in the formation of matter through some physical advent, then they can affect the mental plane in reverse order as well, and that is what they are attempting to do. It's the inversion principle, the inversion process at play. Just so you understand, I hope I'm not losing you out there. Let's continue, though. The sun is the central depository of energy in our solar system. The system of its orbiting celestial spheres offers the resistance by which the radiated solar energy is absorbed by them. The planets, including the asteroid belt, are the only celestial bodies of our solar system which offer such essential physical resistance to solar energy, thereby exposing themselves to the spectrum of the sun. When mass responds in this manner, a similar conscious mental reaction cannot be ruled out. The Qabbalist views not the planetary mass per se as being of primary significance, but ascribes its importance to the accumulated intelligence found therein. Gonna pause for a moment here. So now this is an acknowledgement that there is a type of intelligent design at play in the creation of our universe. At the turn of the century, the English astrologer Alan Leo stressed some of the tenets discussed here in his work, Esoteric Astrology. He observed exoteric manifestations not to be the result of direct physical emanations of planetary masses. As argument, he cites a lecture delivered many years ago by an unnamed but well-known occultist, and that lecture is as follows. This is from an unknown occultist. Quote, "The planets which you see have no influence themselves except the microscopic influence of gravitation. No one supposes otherwise. But there is an influence of some kind not coming from the planets themselves, but working in connection with them. The planets may perhaps be said to represent certain centers in the physical body of the Logos. The sun is used chiefly as his representative, but all the planets of our solar system, being in reality but fragments of the sun, are connected also with the physical body of the great Logos. It has been said that these planets mark certain centers in that body, and when speaking of it, we must remember that it possesses more dimensions than we generally know of. Its physical plane motions indicate the movement of a still higher spheres of influence than we have any knowledge of, and it is the movement of these spheres which produces what is called planetary influence. Our own physical bodies have centers, each of which deals chiefly with one class or subdivision of etheric matter. When any one center is called into activity, it points to the fact that the man is able to respond to the particular vibration of that portion of etheric matter. In all conditions of matter, whether astral, etheric, or otherwise, there are existing elementals of all kinds. Certain parts of the surrounding elemental essence are set in motion when any center is called into activity. Man is then acted on in two ways. Part of the elemental essence within him is set in motion, and also the activity of the elemental essence outside of him is intensified, and that reacts on him. By the position of the physical planets, we can tell where the planetary influence is working at any particular time. If, however, we were clairvoyant, we could see the influence for ourselves, and we should not need the indication which the physical planet gives us. They are like the handles of a clock, pointing out what is happening in those other invisible spheres without being themselves the causes of the influence." And that's the end of the quote. Now, there's a lot to break down in that last passage there that we just read from. So essentially, These different planetary influences correspond with the various chakras inherent in man. Remember, as above, so below, as in the microcosm, so in the macrocosm. The same being said here. It all applies back to this Hermetic principle of correspondence once again, and we could go back to the Qabalistic tradition of Adam Kadmon, the representation of the macrocosm, the universe itself, man being a microcosm thereof. So when you understand symbolically what's being represented here, you can see how there are these various correspondences and how it all is interpenetrated by these inherent intelligent forces. Some refer to them as elementals, and there's different names for these differing intelligences or forces in the various systems. But we see there's something inherent here that steps outside the bounds of what we would recognize in our modern science as a physical type of force or essence or energy. But there is an intelligence behind it. These things are not just all dead essences that guide things. You see, laws cannot function without an intelligence to guide and direct them. So the very existence of natural laws in and of itself tells us that there is intelligence inherent in the design, because if there wasn't, there would be no laws by which things function. It's a misnomer to think otherwise. You wouldn't be able to even trust your own reasoning processes if there is no intelligence inherent in design. So that being the case, this gives us a different way to look at things. But we need to recognize that on the macro scale, in the larger universe, we see reflections of what happens in the microcosm, within the self, within man himself, and on the earth itself. And these things correspond one with another. Let's continue, though. It must be kept in mind, however, that the influence of a mass is almost of equal significance, since the accumulated consciousness of its individual parts manifests through it in a magnified way. This requires a proportional relationship between the degree of absorption to the mass of the respective organism, as well as to the intensity of the ray emanation which provides the organism with its vital life force. It is assumed that the planets, according to their mass and physical constituents, absorbs those spectral rays which correspond to their physical, mineral, gaseous, and other inherent properties. The planets therefore absorb the visible and invisible rays of the sun. They keep what they need for their own existence and radiate the excess of such rays into space. As a rock, which is subjected to the light and heat of the sun, absorbs such heat as long as it is exposed to the rays of the sun, and gives off what it cannot absorb, a relatively larger body possesses a correspondingly greater radius of emanation. So I'm going to pause for a moment here, just to point out the fact here that what's being revealed is that many of these planetary objects that we acknowledge that give off these different energetic influences, they absorb those influences themselves from the sun, and they reflect a portion of that based upon their own substance back out into space and therefore down to Earth here. So the energy and the impartation of information, the data field, if you will, all emanates from the sun. Now, it has been described to me by some people who know some things about this, that you can think of the sun as to being similar to a fiber optic cable. The sun emanates data in a very much similar fashion to a fiber optic cable. And these other bodies out there, they receive some of that information, they absorb some of that information, and they reflect back some of that information in a fashion which is similar to that of a prism, whereas it diffuses some of that information or imparts different parts or portions of that information back based upon its own substance. I hope this makes sense to you. I hope I haven't lost you in this way of thinking. But this seems to be what's being acknowledged here. The sun is the primary source of emanation of this information, this greater information field. And these other smaller bodies reflect that back. They absorb a portion of it themselves, and they reflect the rest back. Now, a lot of this translates to what we would call these invisible rays, these things that we cannot perceive in a physical sense. But there are inherent energies there. There is information there. That's probably the best way to think about it. There's information there that we don't know how to necessarily translate into a perceivable language. But it is absolutely there. And it affects us here in many ways. But let's go ahead and continue reading. Further allowance must be made for the intensity of such rays, which in turn is correlated with the position, i.e. the reinforcements or diminution, or the resulting arcs between the sender and the recipient. This is determined by the orbits of the celestial bodies and the resultant arcs between them. Astronomically and mathematically established orbits of the planets give their exact positions and arcs, which correlate to their degree of resistance toward the Sun. The energy of the Sun, which is absorbed in this fashion, is converted by the planets and released as planetary rays. If the latter do not encounter any resistance by other celestial bodies, they will be dispersed into space and will be hardly noticeable. 5 of such arc positions are considered in this analysis. Number 1, a conjunction, the apparent union of two planets when viewed from Earth. Number 2, the opposition, which indicates a distance of 180 degrees between two celestial bodies. Number 3, the trine aspect, which gives an interval of 120 degrees. Number 4, a square of 90 degrees. And number 5, a sextile of 60 degrees. The polarities ascribed to these positions are of a positive nature for a trine and sextile, but of a negative kind for an opposition and a square. A conjunction can be of either positive or negative polarity, depending upon the nature of the planetary bodies occupying these points in space. These positions of the planets affect, through their positive and negative polarities, all recipients subjected to their influence, in our case, the Earth and its satellite, the Moon. It should be noted that all other planets also form such aspects among themselves. Planetary patterns, as are formed in our zodiacal belt of 360 degrees, cause the manifold combinations of cosmic rays which are absorbed by the respective organisms through breathing, providing them with essential stimuli. Furthermore, they induce reactions on the part of the correspondingly attuned physical organs. The ancients already had established a correspondence between the vital physical organs and other parts of the body to cosmic rays. Going to pause for a moment here. There are many things we could learn from the old natural sciences, the old occult sciences, the old alchemical sciences. You see, ancient man understood a lot of this better than we do. And we've been taught in the modern era to disregard these types of ways of thinking, but it does appear that indeed there is something to this, and it does make sense in a logical, scientific way if you just consider something as basic as sunlight affecting life here on Earth. Stands to reason to think that other rays or emanations being reflected from the sun from other bodies to the Earth can affect us here as well. Of course, they don't want to acknowledge these subtle forces at play. The subtle effects of this information, which is fiber optically being transmitted here. Think of it in that capacity. That is an accurate description of how it works. The sun transmits information to the entirety of the solar system, and some of these planetary bodies and other bodies or things out there in the solar system act as nodes in this system which reflect back the information here to Earth. Earth itself is a node which reacts and transmits information back to these other points in the solar system as well. And there's a correspondence there and a relationship there. So if you can understand in that type of a capacity, in terms, in the technological sense that we're familiar with, that's what we have going on. That's what the sun, in fact, is. It's like a fiber optic connection of information being fed to us here in the entirety of the solar system, and all of the corresponding bodies in the solar system act as nodes in the system. that either absorb some of the data and reflect back other portions of it, or vice versa. So when you could look at it in that way, in that context, it may give you a better understanding. There are subtle energies and influences which come through this data stream to us, and our modern science would like to totally disregard that. But ancient man was a lot more sophisticated than we give him credit for. He understood a lot of this, and these different positions of these planetary conjunctions and alignments in the sky have very real, observable, and measurable influences here, and many of these astrologers and occultists of old understood what could be expected when we see these certain alignments. That's what's being conveyed here. Celestial bodies appear higher in the heavens than they really are. This is due to the refracting or bending of their light rays, the carriers of energy, which is explained by the atmosphere of our Earth. The higher a celestial body appears to be situated above the horizon, the less is the refraction of its rays as they penetrate into the Earth's atmosphere. These rays travel in straight lines until they reach the atmosphere of the Earth, where they are bent by the prevailing atmospheric conditions and forced into a slightly different direction. The neap tides, for example, which occur on the global surface of an arc of 90 degrees between the spring tides, give rise to the theory that the moon's force of attraction acts against that of the sun. The tilt of the Earth's axis of 23.5 degrees against the perpendicular of the Earth's orbit also influences the absorption of solar, lunar, and other planetary rays. It doesn't take much imagination to derive an intricate system from the manifold positions of celestial bodies. The hypothesis of a correspondence between solar and interstellar radiations must therefore be based upon the following. Number 1. Rays emanating from any source are absorbed in relation to the mass and its density which they encounter. Number 2. Such absorbed rays are retained by the recipient to the degree essential for his functions. And number 3. Any excess of rays is again reflected. To deal with the behavior pattern of rays requires a keen sense of differentiation, not only with regard to color analysis, but also in the taxonomy of the interrelationships of colors. The manifold interplay of colors and their combinations constantly provides the investigator with many challenges. One has to occupy oneself with combinations of translucent colored rays and opaque materialized resistors. In any analysis of this kind, it is not possible to confine oneself to a single theory of colors. The theories of Goethe, Oswald, Biron, Itten, or that of any other individual will not in themselves provide us with a key with which to unlock the universal mystery of colors. We have to reach deeper than any of these theories do. Patterns formed by combining multiple interplays of the three primary colors act differently on dense matter than on more subtle resistors. This fact alone already points at some of the difficulties involved in drawing clear definitions. The degree of density and transparency of an object produces different results. Behavior patterns of these various rays are based not only on the source of their basic emanation, but also on the mass of the recipient, both in the quantitative and the qualitative sense. In addition to the existing complexity, one must also consider the immaterial aspects. These factors are indicative of an enormous area of application with regard to all natural phenomena. As has been discussed earlier, the influence of colors is psychologically very pronounced in that it plays a primary role in our sense perceptions. I'm going to pause for a moment here. So there are some subtle aspects of color that influence the human mind in ways that most people don't realize. Of course, people who are familiar with marketing techniques and with human psychology understand how color influences people. Ask the marketing team at McDonald's what it is about the colors red and yellow that they find to be so very important to their logo and to their restaurant design and to their marketing scheme. There's an importance there. All of these factors have very real effects on the human psyche. And not just the human psyche, but the environment as well, things in the environment. There's an important subtle aspect or energy associated with color. That's what we're discussing here. That's what this is primarily about. This is what this whole notion of the 7 rays is about. It's about identifying some of these various characteristics associated with color, the subtle influences of color, and how these rays of emanation that come to us from outside of the earth can influence things. Let's get back to the reading. We restrict ourselves to the immediate sphere of human activity on Earth and the responses to the influence which are encountered. One thing that clearly emerges from all of this is that all dominant rays exert their influences relative to the receptor's capacity to absorb them. We begin to breathe as an independent entity when the umbilical cord which connects us with the source of gestation is severed. Each entity comes under the influence of at least one ray or a combination of rays, depending upon the degree to which the inhaled air is charged with various gaseous substances, such as argon, chlorine, fluorine, helium, hydrogen, krypton, neon, nitrogen, oxygen, radon, and xenon. The absorbed and retained influences determine the aura of an individual. The auric emanation is subject to the continual change due to the constantly changing arcs of the celestial bodies, the intensity of their radiations, as well as to the varying response of the recipient's basic ray to them. This constant ebb and flow of energy causes the development of matter, known as evolution. I'm going to pause for a moment here. So it's about this essence of becoming, as we had alluded to here earlier. All things are in constant states of flux or change or motion, and this is what's being expressed here. Let's continue. The prevailing circumstances permit these rays not only to function, but also enable them to cause different expressions of species in size, color, strength, etc. If these interplays did not take place, all species would have to be similar in nature, and no variations would be possible. Since these laws influence all terrestrial phenomena, evidence of their functions and responses can be ascertained. In this treatise, the attempt is made to outline such influences. Spectral analysis of a sample reveals, with the aid of certain recognizable color rays, its physical characteristics. For example, a predominantly yellow spectral line is indicative of the presence of sodium. It has been established that various other spectral colors, or Fraunhofer lines, signify the existence of other substances. This establishes the physical aspect. But the law of polarity, or duality, also requires the determination of its opposite, namely a manifestation on the immaterial plane. Gonna pause for a moment. So once again, a correspondence being made here between what we would acknowledge as the physical or the hyperphysical and the metaphysical. So now we're going to explore the other side of the coin. This is talking about the physical. These are physical manifestations of color, of characteristics because of color, or represented by color. And we're going to talk about the metaphysical side, the spiritual side, that invisible, immaterial side of the presence of these color vibrations that emanate to us from sources external to the earth. A further mysterious revelation is found in the dispersal of rays caused by refraction. White light is separated into colors. The great mystery of what is color is debatable. We know of its existence similarly as we are aware of the forces emerging out of the rays of energy. As chromatic appearances, they reveal the diversity of innate energy with its carrier. Aside from its predominant physical characteristics, a planet radiates its own individual ray in the form of a primary, secondary, or tertiary color. It is postulated that the combined chromatic influence of the sun exerts its energy upon the planetary mass as a whole. The ancients had already established that the characteristic ray of the sun is signified by yellow, a primary color. Going to pause for a moment here. What have we noticed in recent years about the color of the sun in our sky? I've talked to many people on all different talk shows speaking about this, and going back to looking at the chemtrailing of the sky and how it appears the sun no longer appears to be yellow in the sky. It's more of a whitish color. This is of utmost importance, and for reasons that go just beyond the physical, as we'll see here. The ancients already established long ago that the characteristic ray of the sun is signified by yellow. Let's read on. But it also contains within itself the whole spectrum, an appreciable portion of which must have received from its central sun, i.e. from the fixed star Alcyone, as will be discussed in Chapter 5. I'm going to pause for a moment here. Now, there's an interesting subcontext to all of this, and perhaps we'll explore this at another time. Occultists of yesteryear talked about a second sun, or a source sun, a spiritual sun, and a physical sun. All of these things have crossed the bounds of mythology and culture for the longest time. And they've described some of these various things as fixed stars, like Alcyone, or another popular one is Sirius, the source sun. The Greeks had special terms for this. That's a subject for another time. But at any rate, we see here that Frater Albertus is alluding to a source sun, a secondary sun, from which our visible sun receives influential rays or information from. Likewise, it is postulated that the planet Mercury gives off a predominantly orange-colored ray. Similarly, the Moon, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn cause violet, green, red, blue, and black, similar to indigo rays, respectively. This is indicative of the fact that the planets also exert influences of their own. Going to pause for a moment here. So Saturn is associated with the color black, or a very dark indigo. That's why it's represented by the black cube and various other things. Always the color black with Saturn. The Earth, as one of the celestial bodies, is likewise subjected to the influences of the rays of the sun and the planets, including those of its own satellite, the Moon. The latter also absorbs the rays of the Earth as well as those of the other planets, according to its angular position to the Earth, deflecting and dispersing any excess into space. The Moon, though subjected to the same rays of the sun, does not show any signs of visible life. This is due to the atmospheric conditions surrounding this celestial body. The vapors rising from the waters of the earth caused by the sun's heat act as resistors to penetrating cosmic rays. Even here, differences are observable at various points on Earth, as for example, at the polar caps and the equatorial regions caused by the arc which the Earth makes to these rays. Water is to be found in both regions. Though it is less dense in the cooler than in the warmer zones, these cosmic rays must penetrate at greater atmospheric depth at the polar regions. This manifests itself in the enormous differences in temperature between the equatorial and the polar regions. The Moon, although devoid of water on its surface, offers enough resistance as a mass to cosmic rays, but its atmospheric conditions preclude seasonal changes as we know them. However, with the aid of plastic or other dome-shaped structures in which atmospheric conditions could be maintained, it would be feasible to create the required temperatures to produce moisture below its surface, which in turn could cause significant atmospheric changes. Concentrated thermal increases brought about in this manner could manifest as man-made atmospheric conditions conducive at first to the growth of lichen and mosses, which could later result in a flora and eventual fauna of consequence. All of this represents not only a possibility but a highly likely probability. The resulting chromatic manifestations caused by the solar and reflected planetary rays could then find properly attuned recipients in the flora, which in due time could bring about a colorful vegetation. Before the rays could function as prescribed, they would first have to encounter the proper resistance, which is required to create the measurable force inherent in all living organisms. Extremely prolonged high thermal radiation affecting the moon could bring about such atmospheric changes. All of this would have to be based on the postulate of the ancient sages that cold is moist and heat is dry, a combination of these two producing atmospheric conditions. The moon, as is indicated by its very extreme temperatures, requires an atmosphere offering resistance to the rays, but which will react differently under variable conditions. The foregoing is merely to show why cosmic rays produce different manifestations whenever they encounter a resistance from celestial bodies, including our Earth. Atmospheric conditions appear to be the prime factor for the resulting multitude of manifestations. All living organisms, without exception, depend upon these planetary rays for their existence. The diversity of natural phenomena is based on this fact. The constantly shifting angles of these rays cause pulsations of different frequencies, which bring about the various species of the mineral, vegetable, and animal realms. Qabalistic teachings stress that the moment an entity enters a new cyclic rebirth in any of the natural manifestations of the mineral, plant, or animal kingdoms, it takes upon itself the imprint of the characteristics of the then prevailing rays. This is the so-called signature of all things. The respective entity will adhere strictly to its own species. It will propagate accordingly, and will also slowly change or evolve. Such an imprint seems to be an immutable law for all natural phenomena. Seemingly inanimate or animate forms of the lowest kind depend upon an inherently limited cell consciousness and are thus confined to their predetermined place or sphere of activity. In contrast, mankind creates within limits due to the ability to reason their own environment. An entity endowed with the power to reason can transcend inherent limitations to a certain extent. The sphere of activity we find ourselves in has, unknown to us, been predestined. Our environment is the product of astrocyclic pulsations over which we have no control. Analyzing these important points, we are confronted with such an intricate array of cosmic influences that a systematic application appears to be out of the question. Even a cursory examination could lead us into a maze where we would be hopelessly lost. In this Qabalistic approach, we shall confine ourselves at first to the 7 basic rays discussed here. That's the end of the chapter that we were reading from, and we will carry this over into a part 2. But I wanted to point out a couple of things. So according to Frater Albertus, it seems that based upon what he knew in the 1960s writing about this, it would appear that if conditions on the moon were engineered appropriately, that life could begin to appear on the moon, based upon what he knew about these solar rays and these cosmic rays and these planetary rays, and that there's an inherent energetic principle or fingerprint associated not only with the moon, but with each planet and each body in our solar system that reflects back here to Earth. Now, we were given some of the basic colors associated with these various planets in the sky, and we will go further into depth in the next episode, in part 2 of this, talking about some of the characteristics of these various color rays and how they affect things here on Earth in very subtle ways. The best analogy for thinking about this is think of the sun as a fiber optic cable. It's transmitting information to us, and it strikes various nodes within the system before it gets back to us, and those nodes absorb some of the information and reflect some other of the information back here, and they may actually amplify certain bits of that information back here as well. So when you think of it in that way, you can understand how it does have a very real effect here, especially on a metaphysical level. It affects human consciousness in ways that are scarcely understood in our modern science. But these things were observed and recorded by the occultists of antiquity and the astrologers and the various magicians and secret society groups and schools of thought in the old times, in the days of antiquity. They understood some of the influences here, and they associated specific colors, visible colors of the color spectrum, with some of these correspondences, as we see here, looking at the principal colors associated with the planetary bodies as revealed here in this writing to us by Frater Albertus. So to recap the colors associated with these astronomical bodies as we observe them in our sky and acknowledge them in the mainstream of science. The color yellow is associated with the sun. Mercury is equated to the color orange. The moon, violet. Venus, green, and that's an important color in symbology related to Venus. Mars, red. Jupiter, blue, and of course Saturn, black, or a very dark indigo. So these are the colors of the rainbow associated with each of these planetary bodies in the old astronomical systems, which we are familiar with looking back at the ancient astrology, which of course was the astronomy of the day, and a lot of the connotation between astronomy and astrology in the modern era is very undeserved. They give a negative connotation to anything they consider astrology, and they only view astronomy as being accurate. And this is a misnomer because there's a place for both, and we need to acknowledge both. At one time, they were inseparable. Now they are two separate things representing two sides of the same coin. So anyway, we've explored some of these basic primary colors and how they associate with these various objects in space and their influence here in this world. And we will explore this way of thinking a little further. These rays offer us a different way of looking at things, understanding some of the subtle factors which influence behaviors and events in this world. You see, at the topmost levels of the power structure of this world, there are people who understand to a deeper degree the correspondences of some of these things, and they leverage them to suit various agendas which benefit them but don't benefit the whole of humanity at large. So it's important we understand some of these things. It's important that we really consider some of these ways of thinking, because whether you believe it or not is irrelevant. The important portion to remember is that there are people in positions of power in this world that very much believe in these concepts, and the things they do to act upon their beliefs will affect all of us. So it's important that you know it, whether you think there's anything to it or not. That's why we look at this stuff. And I think Frater Albertus had a pretty good understanding, a thorough understanding of the concepts associated with the QBL, known as the Kabbalah, and the various sciences that have arisen from it. Even our modern sciences arise from some of these old sciences. This is what has been largely misunderstood by people. Much of our modern materialist science is hearkening back to some of these ideologies and trying to apply them in a strictly physical paradigm, the hyperphysical paradigm, to influence people's way of thinking, to align with this hyperphysical way of thinking. So, that being the case, they've leveraged some of these very principles to further ensconce us into that hyperphysical paradigm, that hypermaterialist paradigm, as I like to call it, that way of thinking, whereas this physical world is all there is and there's nothing else, there's no spiritual things to be concerned with. That's what they want you to believe. That's the ideology they want you to buy into, because that makes you significantly easier to control. If you totally disregard the spiritual side of things and think in strictly these physical terms, then they got you right where they want you, and that you will be ripe for the picking for the transhumanist singularity, which is what they are ultimately working towards. And they're leveraging some of these old alchemical sciences to bring it into fruition. But they don't want you to understand it, or even know the methods that they're using to bring these things into being. That's where this stuff comes in. That's why it's important that we explore these ideologies. So next time, we will explore a little deeper, and we'll look at what Frater Albertus describes as these astrocyclic pulsations, and what is the nature of these and how they affect us here on Earth. Anyway, that's all the time we have for tonight. I want to thank you all for tuning in, and I would like to remind you that I appreciate each and every one of you more than you can ever know. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time. Have a good night now.